going to start the recording. Great. And say welcome. I am so happy to be back. We were on break for 2 weeks. We were on break last week for a scheduled break, and we didn't have Talking Data Equity the week before that because I had a migraine. So I missed you very much, and thank you, of course, for all your patience and kindness while I regained my health. And what we were going to do that day, that last Friday in August, is something that we call data amnesty. And since we didn't get to do it that day because I had a migraine, we're going to do that today. We're going to do data amnesty today as our kind of theme of talking data equity. And if this is your first time at Talking Data Equity, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And I mean that genuinely. That's not just something somebody told me to say. Talking Data Equity is something that we do most Fridays, not every single Friday, but most Fridays at this time, noon, my time. I'm in Toronto. And what Talking Data Equity is an open, there's no charge. It's open to anybody who wants to join in. It's a place where we try and have conversations, practical conversations about the different ways that each of us are trying to apply data equity ideas and use data equity tools in our research. And so sometimes we have a special topic, sometimes we have a special guest, and it's always interesting, casual, laid back. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment at any point in today's data equity, there's 2 ways to do that. You can always ask a question at any time using the Zoom chat, and you can use the Zoom chat set to everybody in the meeting, and then everybody who's here will be able to see your name and see your question or your comment, and that's fantastic. If you're more comfortable remaining private and you want to ask a question anonymously, then simply choose my name, Heather Krause, in that Zoom drop-down menu, and send me your question as a direct message. And I can't always promise to get to every single one of the questions that is sent to me as a direct message, but I do my best to get to as many as we can. And I'll ask the question out loud or read your comment out loud, but I won't read your name so that you will still be private. And what we're doing today is called data amnesty, and data amnesty is something I've been doing for many years. And the idea is that it's a place to ask questions that you might not feel comfortable asking. And I got the idea for data amnesty I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is on a state on the east side of the United States. And I really, really liked to read. And so I would check out a lot of books from the library when I was a little kid. And I wasn't always great about returning my library books. And so once a year, my local library had a thing called Library Book Amnesty Day. And you could bring back any book in any condition, no questions asked. Like, they just really wanted their library books back. So if you brought your library books back on that day, even if they were wet or if your dog had chewed on them or if they were like 6 months overdue, they would just take them. Your fines were forgiven, no questions asked, because what they really wanted was their library books back. And that's the idea here with data. One of the things that has happened I thought it was really clever too. I loved Data Amnesty Day at my library. So thank you, Central Pennsylvania Public Libraries. And so when I started to realize that one of the issues that we had in kind of the data world is that a lot of people who are in positions of leadership, positions of power, got to those positions kind of before the big data revolution, before you needed to be comfortable talking about and thinking about and understanding data to make like public policy decisions or make public health decisions or make impact investment decisions, things like that. And because that was the way that people kind of got into leadership positions, before they really needed to know a lot about data, sometimes they were reluctant to ask questions, especially questions that seemed elementary or basic, that they were sure that people kind of younger than them, or it's not always an age thing, like below them in kind of their organizational hierarchy, would think were like obvious questions. And so they would lose status or lose face by asking these simple questions. And so much like a library, I really, really want people who are in a position to make decisions to ask the questions much more than I want to worry about who has what status and things like that. Not all the time, but during data amnesty sessions. So I started going to conferences and running these things called data amnesty sessions, where anybody can submit a question anonymously or publicly. And it doesn't, if you think it's an embarrassing question, this is a great time to do that, because really there are no embarrassing questions. There are no stupid questions. There are no questions that are so basic that you shouldn't ask them. And so that's what data amnesty is and why I do it. And so we kind of been putting out little type form open-ended survey questions saying, give us your questions. What do you want to ask? And we do have quite a few people who have submitted questions in advance, which is fantastic. And of course, it is completely fine and wonderful if you are here and you have a question and you didn't submit the question. So how we're going to do this is, if you are in the room and you have a question, either put it into the chat or raise your hand. You can raise your hand on Zoom if you go on the Zoom menu to the little reactions button. And it's like a little smiley face with a plus on its head, at least in my Zoom. And then you can raise your hand. And so if you want to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand or put it into the chat. And while you think about your questions, I'm going to start with the questions that were submitted anonymously. So, and I'm not going to go in a particular order. When I was preparing for today, I tried to kind of group them in a couple of kind of buckets, but I want to make sure that we get to as many different kind of types of questions as we have. So, and by the way, for people who submitted the questions, I can't thank you in person because it's anonymous, but the questions were fantastic. And some of them were worded in such lovely, lovely ways that it really made my day. So I'm going to share my screen now, because I brought some slides with me, and you can hopefully see that. So one of the first questions, excellent, people in the room are also putting in questions, so that's great. And always to the caveats, don't worry, you don't have to caveat your question. So one of the questions that a few people asked was, I don't think I really understand the difference between a sample and a population when we're talking about data, and I don't really understand why that matters. So that is a really, really good question. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that will hopefully explain that. And if you're here and it doesn't explain it, feel free to keep asking for more nuanced explanation in the chat. So essentially, when we're using data and we are trying to understand how a group of people thinks about something or is experiencing something, so I'm going to use something fairly straightforward here. So I'm going to say we have money in our town budget. It's the end of our fiscal year and we have money left over that we need to spend. And we're trying to figure out, should we make a dog park or should we make a swimming pool? And we want to do a survey to try and understand what our community feels. And the picture I'm showing you is the community. This is the community of people that we want to understand using quantitative data. Do they want a dog park or do they want a swimming pool? Now, if we spend all of our money conducting a survey, which can be very expensive and time consuming, we won't be able to have a dog park or a swimming pool. So instead, we want to ask enough people in our community that we have an answer to the question that we feel kind of confident about, but that we've spent as little money as possible to kind of come to that. Instead of asking every single person, we're going to ask some of the people in our community, and we're going to use that data. And the way we decide to do it is to take a survey. And I'm sorry, this is a horrific, very old stock picture of a survey, but you'll just have to forgive me for that horrible picture. So when we ask some of the people in our community our survey questions about whether they want a dog park or a swimming pool, the people that we ask in our community, those people turn into something that on a technical level is called a sample. So when you say, I don't really understand what a sample is, this is what a sample is. A sample is a small group of a larger group, and that larger group is who you want to understand. Now, there are many, many different ways to get a sample. And I'm not going to go into all of the technical aspects. I know that we do have a kind of a running list of deep dives on technical topics that we're going to go into, and sampling is one of those deep dives. We are going to do a deep dive on sampling, but this is not the deep dive day. But how you get your sample, how you decide who from your community gets included in this sample. In other words, who from your community gets to answer this survey question has a really big impact on how you can use the data in your sample and how good of a job your sample is going to do at getting you an answer, swimming pool or park or dog park or swimming pool, getting you an answer that actually represents the whole community. If you ask everybody in your sample, do you want a dog park or a swimming pool, you'll almost for sure be able to get a pretty good idea of what your sample wants. The tricky bit is understanding what the answer to your real question, which is, how does my community feel? You don't really want to know how your sample feels. You want to know how your community feels. And unless you have done a very, very expensive, very, very hard to implement, very, very fancy thing in order to get people from the community into your sample is not going to be exactly the same, right? Like the way that your sample feels about dog park or swimming pool isn't going to correspond exactly to the way your community feels. And that's why people talk about sampling a lot. How you get your sample really matters. And what you need to do with your sample data also really matters and is a really big equity issue. For example, if even a few of the people who in your sample that you wanted to complete your survey, if you went to your community and asked a lot of people in your community to answer your survey, and some of the people said, yeah, sure, I'll answer it, and they do, and then some of the people are like, no, thank you, I don't want to participate in your survey. What you have now is a convenience sample. So you have a sample that is not going to be easy to work with, but isn't going to be impossible to work with. So essentially what we do is some fancy math, usually, but not always. That math is called weighting. And we use some fancy math to kind of get the feelings of your sample to more accurately reflect the community feelings about dog park versus swimming pool. So that's what a sample is. That's why people talk so much about sampling, is that there are equity issues in who in your community gets to be part of your sample. And then there are also equity issues in terms of when you take this sample and you try and turn it through a bunch of fancy math into a statement about the community, the way that you do this math is deeply embedded with your view of the way the world works and what is important in trying to take this little bit of data and make meaning for a big amount of data. So I'll leave it there. Again, this is a really, really good question, and I'm very, very thrilled that you asked it. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to take some questions that are in the chat. Okay. I feel weird not knowing if the answer is yes or no. I love this question. A lot of data equity discussions focus on the data processing and analysis parts of the data lifecycle. Strongly agree. But is data equity something we need to consider when it comes to something like data visualization? Like for something even as simple as presenting data in a chart? If so, do you have any recommendations on where we should begin learning more about it? I adore this question. Thank you so much for asking this question. And so I'm going to tell you my opinion. And my opinion is strongly yes. I would agree very much that a lot of the data equity discussion is focused on processing and analysis. And however, the communication aspect of generating evidence is critical for data equity. And the way that something gets communicated has very, very deep choices embedded in it. And one of those choices is how data is visualized. And I actually, anyways, no, that's a tangent. I'm not going to go on the tangent. One of the things about data visualization that has changed a lot in the many decades that I've been doing this is it used to be really hard and really expensive to do data visualization. And recently, there have popped up lots and lots of new ways to do data visualization that are, they're not totally accessible, but they're much more accessible to many more people. And this has resulted in a lot of the beginnings of the democratization of data visualization, which is a fantastic thing. Some data visualization professionals, not all of them, but some of them got very concerned about this for a very understandable reason. They started to worry that if you haven't been trained in like the theory of data visualization, you might accidentally make data visualizations that are incorrect and misleading. And a misleading picture is a very powerful thing. There can be very negative consequences from a misleading picture. And so they started to make rules and they started to make rules about what you have to do and what you cannot do in order to visualize something correctly. And again, I really understand that, why they did that. And those rules aren't, entirely wrong or off base, but the problem with those rules is that they are certainly not very attuned to who specifically you are trying to communicate with. When you kind of say to some, again, this is not everybody who's a data visualization. It's just the thing to watch out for. If somebody comes to you and gives you a list of things that you have to do or cannot do when you visualize data, you want to say, why? Why do we have to or cannot do these things? And often they'll say, well, it's been tested in the peer-reviewed human cognition literature. And that is true. However, if you dig deep into the methodology of those peer-reviewed human cognition articles, you will find that the vast majority of those articles are based on research participants who attend university largely in the United States or Canada, a couple of countries in Western Europe. And that is, of course, not human cognition. That is cognition or preferences in viewing data and interpreting charts by people who've been already taught for a long time how to think about data, how to think about charts, what direction time goes, what visual hierarchies mean, and things like that. So I'm not saying that those rules are all junk, but I'm saying you should maybe interpret them as suggestions and ideas, not rules. And you should think very carefully about who it is you're trying to communicate with. So absolutely, there is 100% data equity issues in data visualization. Everything from the color that you use, the symbols that you use, what direction you think time goes in, what axes, what icons you use, all of it. Do I have recommendations on where we should be learning more about that? I am not great at giving recommendations for this. So if there is somebody here who is great at giving recommendations for this, one of the places I know is really working on this issue, I'm not really sure where they are, but they're thinking about it, is a place called the Data Visualization Society, which is a pretty big group of people. And I'm pretty sure they have a website. I'm actually just going to see if I can Google it now. But I know they're thinking about it a lot. And yes, they do have something. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat to this. Right. Thank you. Olivia is sharing that there is a Do No Harm guide by the Urban Institute, which is also true. And actually, thank you for saying that, because I was a reviewer on that guide. I should know that. That is an excellent guide. I will put that link into the chat as well. And we have a tool that is called the Reverse Engineer Data Viz Legend. And I don't think we have a very good article on our website about that yet that I can link to you, but know that it is something that we are working on. Great question. Perfect question. And there are, oh, great. Yes. Yes, people are commenting on the graphics that I just showed, and I am fully aware that those graphics were not great. Those graphics were quite old. And I decided that the optimization of being able to talk about sampling was worth it. But I hear you. Okay. Okay, this is a great question that is coming from somebody in the room, so I'm going to take it. I do not understand this very well, but from what I understand, in many regression models, the largest group within a categorical variable is used as the reference group. For example, for race variables, white is often the largest group in many studies, and it feels icky to set white as the standard. How can we get around this? Okay, that is a fabulous question. Thank you for asking that question. So essentially the question is, when you're doing a regression model, and a regression model is really one of the most popular standard ways to do statistical analysis. If you're doing any kind of statistical analysis, chances are pretty good it's going to include a regression model of some sort. There are lots of flavors of regression models, but essentially what a regression model is, I don't think I have a slide with me that shows a regression model, but essentially, actually, let me check. I'm going to keep talking, but I am going to flip through slides to see if I have a picture. Essentially, a regression model is you put a lot of variables into this model and try and understand how these variables work together to predict something. And the thing that you're trying to predict is called the outcome or the dependent variable, things like that. So let's say that we are trying to predict, no, I don't have a model at hand. So I'm just going to answer the question verbally, but I'm not going to promise, but I would like to draw a little picture of this and put it on the forum afterwards. So let's say that we are trying to predict something like the probability that somebody is experiencing food insecurity. So the outcome of this regression model is going to be food insecurity. And to stick with your example, let's say that the the things that we're using in the regression model to relate to food insecurity will be race, and let's just pick something easy like age. So a regression model would be like age plus race equals food insecurity. And we want to know how age and race are affecting a person's probability of being food insecure. What this person is asking is a very important thing. So the age variable is what's called a continuous variable. So that means there's, what is the technical? So a continuous variable like age means that the numbers all run together. It's, it's an infinite list of numbers. So you can be one in year 1 month, 1 year, 6 months, 2 years. So it's a continuous variable. But race is like a categorical variable. And that means that it's not really numbers, it's more like buckets. It's usually coded as numbers, like 1 if you're, as this person is saying, 1 if your race is categorized as white, 2 if your race is categorized as American Indian, 3 if your race is categorized by Black, 4 if your race is categorized by East Asian, 5 if your race is categorized as South Asian, 6 if your race is categorized as, as many race categories as you have in your data. And so when we are trying to see how race is related to food insecurity, we can't just get a number because these categorical variables aren't numbers. So instead, what we usually end up doing is setting one of our categories as the default category. And sometimes it's called the reference category, sometimes it's called the baseline category, but it is the category that we're going to use to build the model, and then we're going to compare and contrast all the other categories with that as we interpret the model. So what this person is saying is, from my understanding, we often set the largest group as the reference or the default. And so often in my data, the largest group is white. And I don't want to do that. I don't, even mathematically, I don't want to set white as the reference group. So fabulous question. I'm so happy to talk about this. So a couple of things. First is that in terms of interpreting, like in terms of the number that you will get when you say, if a person is East Asian, how likely are they to be food insecure? Or if a person is First Nations, how likely are they to be food insecure? Those actual numbers are not going to be different depending on what you set as your categorical variable. In most regression models, of course, not in every single, but in most, what you set as your baseline or default or reference category isn't actually going to change the final result in your data story. It is, however, going to change what comes out of like the technical regression summary in whatever software you're using. So it is going to change that. And if you're in the habit, which is not a good habit, but and we'll talk about that later, but if you're in the habit of kind of just looking through a regression results table and trying to make meaning from that, then your reference category is going to have a very big impact on how you interpret the model. So you are correct to be concerned. And so I haven't heard of the practice of setting the largest group as the categorical variable, as the reference. In most of the statistical programs that I'm aware of that run these kind of models, often the way you enter the data is going to set what's the reference category. A lot of these programs will just use them in alphabetical order. And so whatever category is first in the alphabet, so in our case, and like the few examples I gave, I think it would be either American Indian or East Asian. I'm not really sure what examples I used, but the whatever's alphabetically first. However, the real best practice, if you're concerned about equity, is to go into whatever program you're using and manually tell it what you want to be the default, what you want to be the reference. And you can do that very, very, very easily. And it can be different for every single regression model. So that's what you should do. And that's what you should ask your IT folks or your analysts to do. And that's a really, really good question. I was not expecting that question. That is a fabulous question. Thank you for asking it. Okay. People are putting very helpful links in the chat, which I really appreciate. All right. So one of the questions that I got a lot of, which I really appreciate, is I'm new to data equity. I don't know what types of demographic data should be collected and how to get started. Really kind of partner question to this, what several people said. Do you have a standard recipe for asking demographic questions on surveys? For example, I need the appropriate standardized best practices to ask about gender identification, race and ethnicity, and disability. These are great questions, very important questions. And the answer is no, I don't. I don't have a recipe for the best or most appropriate ways to collect demographic data. And I know that's an unsatisfying answer, but it honestly is probably never going to change. And the reason that it isn't going to change is this is going to answer the first question, how to get started. How to get started is the first thing that you need to know when you're choosing categories is what are you actually trying to understand about a person? So if you are collecting race data, are you trying to understand whether or not that person has had an experience of racism? Are you trying to understand the color of that person's skin? Are you trying to understand what country their parents or they themselves were born in? Are you trying to understand which community they feel most closely affiliated with? These are just a handful of many, many reasons that you might want somebody to answer a question about race. And until you can answer that question, what are you trying to understand about that person? You can't get started figuring out what categories you should ask. And then once you do understand what it is, like what experience or characteristic you're trying to make meaning about or to control for or account for, then you need to think about who do you need this information to fit the best for? So you can think about demographic categories like a t-shirt. You can make a one-size-fits-all t-shirt. And, one person can try and get into that t-shirt. They can kind of squeeze themselves into that t-shirt. It's not really comfortable, but they can get in it. Another person puts on the t-shirt. They're like swimming around. It's down on their ankles, but they're in it. It technically fits them. And then this other person comes along and puts that t-shirt on and it looks like it was custom bespoke made for them. It just fits them perfectly. Demographic categories are like that. You can kind of make demographic categories that people will fit into, but whoever fits into your demographic categories like a glove are the people that you are privileging in the way that you have designed those categories. And so you need to think about who am I trying to privilege? Who do I need the most accurate information for? Who needs to see themselves most congruently represented in the way that I ask these categories? So those are the first two questions that you need to think about before you can start crafting some demographic categories. But that is a really, really good question. Can the reference group be set as the entire population? Great question. The answer is no. No, because if you are trying to understand how different groups of people in your regression model different race categories or having different experiences of food insecurity, you are for sure going to, and I think I do have a picture of this with me today, you are for sure going to need to get a measure for every single one of your groups. And what that means is you have to set one of your groups as default. And again, this is a lot like the word unbiased. One of the problems, and we might get to this, but one of the problems with the word bias is that it has a mathematical meaning, which means if you do this process over and over again in the same way, you'll get a similar answer. And then it has like a street meaning, which is fair. Same thing with like the default category in a regression model. When we say, oh, good, I do have a picture of this. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. When we say default category in a regression model, you can see that this is a very old slide, just like the sampling was. This is from like my old company and the slides weren't very good. So you'll have to just forgive me for the substandard visuals today. Just like bias and unbiased have a mathematical word and a street word or a non-mathematical interpretation that gets people confused. Same thing with default categories in regression. Setting something as a default category in a mathematical regression model does not mean that you are assuming that that group is the biggest, or that that group is the best, or that that group is the normative group. Now, it does leave the door open to incorrect interpretation of a regression summary table. However, you should never ever make interpretations from a regression summary table. So that's a bad practice in general, but it is possible. Some people do it. And so that is why I would spend time setting your default. But you can't set it to everyone, and it isn't actually going to change the numbers. Okay, so I'm showing you this picture. This picture is what it looks like when we like visualize the response to a regression or visualize the output. So again, I know that these are terrible visuals. So this up and down axis here would be the likelihood of somebody being food insecure. And this, again, remember, we're doing age and race. I'm just so lucky that these visuals are correct. So up and down axis is whether or not somebody is food insecure. And then this flat horizontal axis is age. And you can see that these are our lines. So these are the results from our regression. You can see that as people age, they become more likely to be food insecure. Now, why there's two lines here is because we're using a categorical variable. So let's just pretend we're using race. Let's just pretend we have two groups in our regression model. I'm not even going to name what the two groups are because you would never really want two groups for race, but let's just pretend we have two racial groups. When you include a categorical variable like race, remember it's not a continuous variable like age, it's a categorical variable, you're going to get a different line for each group. And so you can see that the relationship between age and food insecurity is different for racial group 1 and racial group 2. And this line is going to be the same whether group 1 is the default group in your mathematical model or group 2 is the default group in your mathematical model. Like the lines aren't going to be in a different place if you put a different group as the default. Your regression output will look different, but never try and make decisions or interpretations based on regression output. Okay, while we're looking at this picture, I'm going to answer another question, which is, what does it mean to do intersectional analysis? So this is what it means This is why we might do intersectional analysis. So this is the same data, the same model, but used intersectionally. So this is still whether or not somebody is going to be food insecure, and this is still age. And these lines are still the two racial groups that we have. But when we put age and race into this model, we put it in intersectionally. Very basic way to think about it is we multiplied age by race instead of added age by race. And what this means, if you just look at it one at a time, like age and race, it means that you are forcing the outcome, the results of your data, that the trends are going to be the same. The lines are always going to be parallel in your results. So you're going to assume that everybody gets more food insecure as they get older, but the amount of food insecurity changes by race. If you do an intersectional analysis, you're saying the relationship between age and race is going to be different for different races. You can see that when we do it intersectionally, there is not, the results do not say that for racial group 2, as people age, they become food insecure. That is actually the experience of racial group 1. And so if you only do what's called marginal or additive, if you only add the demographics or the social identity data together, you're going to force everybody to experience the same trend, just different amounts of the same trend. But if you multiply things together, you allow people all the different combinations of your variables, in this case, age and race, to have lines that go in different directions in your results. All right. Last thing I'm going to say about intersectionality, because we had a lot of people write in about intersectionality, is actually, yes, I'm going to say this. So essentially, what intersectionality is when we assume that having two experiences at the same time is different than one person having one of those experiences. So in other words, if we're trying to understand student outcomes, and we know that some of our students are experiencing poverty, some of our students are experiencing racism, some of our students have poor academic preparation, doing an intersectional analysis means that we understand, or we want to take into account in our math, that students who are experiencing poverty and racism at the same time are going to be different than a student that's only experiencing poverty or a student that's only experiencing racism. And this is the last sentence is a little bit tricky in that it's multiplicative. The effect of poverty plus the effect of racism is different than the cumulative combined effect of experiencing poverty and racism at the same time. So if a student who's experiencing poverty is like 5% less likely to graduate, and a student experiencing racism is 5% less likely to graduate, if we want to take into account the cumulative impact, what it feels like to be a student experiencing poverty and racism, we can't just add those two 5% and assume that a student that's experiencing both is going to have 10% less chance. We have to actually go in and look at the data. And oftentimes it'll be like 12% or 15%, because rather than 10%, because there's a cumulative multiplicative impact. So that's what intersectionality is. And the way you put it into a model is instead of adding things together, you multiply them. And then on the output, you'll see something a lot like what I was just showing, which is that the lines in your findings from your model will intersect. because it's intersectional. They won't be required to always be parallel, everybody having the same experience, just different amounts. I know that that is very, very complicated. Yes. Okay. Great questions. I love these open-ended forums. Okay. It is almost 10:02, so we have about 5 minutes left. And I'm trying to decide, we have a couple of questions in the chat, and I want to see if any of the questions in the chat I've brought slides for, because I know slides is always better because it's visual. And these are always crazy hard ideas, even though you're often saying this is a very simple question. It is, data is very complicated. Okay. How do we, as equity advocates, balance and account for concerns about quote unquote statistical significance for smaller groups with the very real challenges and concerns that those groups face? This comes up a lot in our healthcare system when we have low numbers for things like readmission, pressure injuries, et cetera. Okay, that's a really good question. And I will direct you to, we've talked a little bit about statistical significance in a previous Talking Data Equity, but we didn't really address your specific question. But if you want to hear more about not just my ideas, but lots of people's ideas about statistical significance, especially as it relates to group sizes, I would strongly recommend that, I'm going to put the link into the chat. The link I put into the chat is to our community forum. It's not a membership site. You don't have to pay, and it doesn't serve you ads or harvest your data. And there's a Talking Data Equity section in that forum. And if you search that for significance, you'll find a video with some links. But I don't think it answers your question. So your question is, lots of times there are small groups of people who are small through no fault of their own, and we often don't get to make meaning for them. Is there a solution to that? So the answer is yes. Part of the answer is has to do with the relation of statistical significance with the number of people that you're trying to make meaning for. And frankly, in a lot of people's minds, there's a relationship between the size of the group of people that you're trying to make meaning for and statistical significance that is technically and mathematically incorrect. So if I have a group of 10 people who have a pressure injury, I'll use your example. I don't know anything about pressure injuries, so I'm not going to get the content right. But let's just say I have 10 people who have a pressure injury, and I want to understand, were they satisfied with the services that they received in that healthcare setting? I can make meaning from those 10 people's answers to how satisfied they felt. Like, let's just say they got to rank, how satisfied are you on a scale of 1 to 10? I can make meaning from those 10 responses without any relationship to statistical significance. There is no measure of statistical significance for a sample size. People think there are because people have been taught things in problematic ways. So there's no way to test for statistical significance of a sample size. However, what is true is that if you have, say, 10 people who have pressure injuries that are telling you how they feel about their service they received, you have a lot of information about those 10 people. You will know exactly how those 10 people feel. There's no problem with that at all. The problem is when you want to take information from those 10 people and generalize it to maybe all the people in your district or your state who have had a pressure injury. That's where small sample sizes matter, because you only have information from, if you were here when we started today, you have only information from a small group of the bigger community that you're trying to make meaning for. And what that's going to lead to is uncertainty around how well the survey results from those 10 people match what would be the survey results from lots and lots of people. And that's also not a statistical significance issue, but it is a certainty issue. And so the first thing you need to do is be really, really honest about the level of certainty that you have. There are mathematical ways to calculate that certainty. But the other thing to do, and we do actually have an article about this that I will try and put a link to in the forum. It's something called the finite population adjustment. And that means that if you have data from only 10 people, but those 10 people represent like 25% of all the people in your area that have pressure injuries, that sample size of 10 is actually worth like a sample size of like 60 or 70, because it's a big, big percentage of all the people you're trying to make meaning for. And so a finite population sample adjustment is really useful in your situation and very, very simple to do. You don't need software to do it. You can do it with a piece of paper or you can do it in Excel. And I'm pretty sure we have an article on it that I will link in the forum. And if we don't, we will publish one because we certainly have a lot of information about it. Awesome. Okay, so we try and end this at 5 to 1 so that if you have back to back, you have time to be human, take a breath. So I'm not going to answer any more questions. We will do a kind of an open-ended thing again really soon, but we have some very, very cool things coming up that I want to make sure you know about. First of all, next Friday, September 16th, no talking data equity. I am going into the field for the next 4 weeks, and I will be on a plane next Friday. I am still going to be doing talking data equities from the field, but just not next Friday, because very disappointed to say that I am on a plane. And I don't think that my seatmates would appreciate me talking for an hour, even if I could get Wi-Fi or something. So sadly, no talking data equity next week. But after that, we have a journalist who really dug deep into how gun violence is defined when she was doing some reporting in Missouri. Week after that, we have Dr. Yanni Loukisas, who has written a book called All Data Are Local. Fantastic. And the Friday after that, we have the deputy director of the Black Census Project. And if you aren't familiar with the Black Census Project, I would Google it. It's happening right now. You can actually get involved. It's a very, very cool project that she will be sharing all about. So that's the next 4 weeks. Thank you so much. I absolutely have come to adore Friday afternoons because I get to hang out with all of you, and I am loving getting to know all of you. And some people are putting in what you want to talk about, and I will do my best to remember it. But let me actually give you a link, because I will for sure remember it if you tell me the topics that you want to talk about in that type form. It's private, it's open-ended, you can write whatever you want. Awesome. Have a great rest of your day. And I won't see you next Friday. See you in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone. Bye. You're welcome.